morning, and thank you for joining Coffee Time with Masterminds. For the last several weeks, we've been talking about leadership programs, my favorite topic, if you're not tired of me saying that. But I could talk all things leadership, and I have just enjoyed the guests that we have had on. We've talked about leadership programs for focus on BIPOC emerging leaders and why that's important. Last week, we had Fahad Bahati, and he talked about a leadership program that is not only fostering leadership in New Haven, Connecticut. There are over 600 strong, and they are just blowing out the park and changing the nonprofit landscape at New Haven. And today, we have an exciting show. We're going to talk about why seasoned leaders should continue their learning and what they should know about leadership in complex times. Join us.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee Time with Masterminds. My name is Peta Blakely, and I'm the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth.
Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and principal of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good.
How cool is that? Welcome, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for joining us. And if you are watching us, please put your name and where you're from in the comments. We also want to welcome our listeners in Australia. Thank you for joining us, and the people around the world who listen to us on their own time and get to hopefully learn all things leadership from mission-based organizations. So welcome. And I am excited to bring on my co-host, Peta Blakely. Peta, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm really good. Today is another exciting show about leadership. Are you excited?
I am. I mean, the more we talk about this subject, the more I realize there is to learn.
Yeah, there is a lot to learn. And today we have two amazing individuals. That's rare where we have two guests,
Yes.
Right? We used to have a lot of that in the beginning, often, but now we often have one guest, and today we have two. One guest is Melissa Harris, and she works at Fio Partners. And Melissa's coming on because she developed an amazing leadership program on adaptive leadership. And then we have Forrest Helvie. And so Forrest works for fostering leaders all throughout the state of Connecticut and all the community colleges. So that's a lot of work. And so today we are going to talk about why today's leader needs to continue their learning, especially during these times. Hello, Melissa and Forrest. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no, this is great. We're so excited.
So, I mean, I usually think of leadership development programs as being for new leaders or emerging leaders or people who are about to transition into leadership. But today we're talking about programs for people who are already in leadership roles. Tell me why that's important.
Good
Of
question.
course, you want to go first since you're kind of working across the spectrum?
Sure. I think one of the things that struck me just in in higher education, I up in the past year, I was full-time faculty, as the coordinator for professional development at Norwalk Community College, department chair. And, one of the things that really struck me in higher education, my experience kind of bared out with colleagues, across the country really, is how often are people trained for the positions that they're going to step into? Frequently in my world as a faculty member, you're brought on, you teach for a few years, and then maybe you're moved into a coordinator role. And then the coordinator may get moved into a department chair, and the department chair may get moved into the academic dean position, at which point you're overseeing all academics at your respective college. And how many deans have ever been actually trained to do the job that they're doing, and yet consider the impact that their work has on hundreds, if not thousands, of students, and certainly hundreds of faculty and staff. The risk is really high to play that loosely, in my mind.
Yeah.
So I will say, after I graduated college, I spent 4 years as an artillery officer, which isn't necessarily the most smooth transition from being an English faculty. But we learned about succession planning, and you always learned 2 seats up in case, so you had to step in temporarily and fill. And so I think you may be living in the moment in your current role, but you don't know when that next opportunity is going to arrive. And have you been properly developed for it so that you can be successful and that you can help the team that you're going to work with be successful? So I think having that long-term range and planning is essential for organizational health and wellness, short, long, and long-term.
Yeah.
I love that. Can I add, Forrest, you said 2 seats up. So is that the organization should be thinking about its potential leaders and booming them for 2 seats up? Or should we have enough bench strength for, tell me a little bit about what 2 seats up was.
Well, I think the principle behind it is this, is that just say as a faculty member, just somebody who's teaching his classes, and that's my focus. If I understand the priorities and the concerns that my coordinator, my department chair have, then from a conceptual perspective, I understand better how I fit into that larger picture. And if I'm growing as a professional with a constant understanding of how I fit into a bigger picture, as I move up, then I continue on thinking big picture. I'm not focused just on my narrow lane. And I think that that's an essential skill for leaders at all levels, whether, the emerging leader, those continuing mid-career leaders, or senior leaders. Think about those organizations where we've been most frustrated. What was their conceptual understanding of what's the big picture here? What's the ecosystem that we're operating in, not just in my lane?
So many organizations talk about being siloed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Programs not talking to each other. So yeah, what an amazing potential if everybody was thinking about the organization instead of just the program that they're running.
Absolutely. And if we then think about that in terms of the experience of seasoned nonprofit leaders, it holds true in that space as well. And everybody is slammed right now. And so even those seasoned leaders need that intentional space to slow down and think strategically about challenges, how to communicate them, and how to bring people along in a way that's aligned with the organization's values. And that's where these programs, I think, can really help, is giving leaders, even seasoned ones, that dedicated space to just take that breath and think about these things and be reflective in a way that they often don't get on a day-to-day basis because they're so busy running their agencies. And
I think that they especially haven't had in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a lot of frantic adjusting.
yeah,
And the word pivoting is super overused. Like it was a pivot the first time. Now it's just
now I'm
frantic adjustment. But the idea that you have to go slow to go fast.
Yes.
That you've got to step back and think strategically.
Yes.
Even in the midst of all that turmoil.
Yes.
One of the things I always try to think about is, and we hear, thinking about, we have to think strategically, but how do I actually do that? And how do I set the stage so that my organization has a culture of thinking strategically? And I kind of think that it doesn't have to necessarily be 2 seats up. That was just kind of what I remember kind of growing up with as a young military officer. But that concept of putting people into positions early on that maybe that's not their formal role, but giving those opportunities. So, if Melissa's my supervisor, maybe once in a while, she lets me go to these staff meetings so I can kind of see what all of her peers are concerned with and focused on. And then I can kind of report back. And I think when you create those spaces and opportunities, you're growing strategic thinkers. You're growing folks who have that ability to slow down and see how do these other parts all fit and move together, both parts within your internal organization, but also those external stakeholders you've got to engage with.
I love this. And so, we mentioned the term seasoned leaders. And so what else? So someone that's been doing this for 8-9 years, what else do you think they have to learn? What's different?
It's different. I mean, there are obviously so many frameworks and approaches to things. And, more than any one framework being better than another. No framework is complete. Everyone has its shortcoming. Every framework has its shortcomings. But I think it's just more that discipline around stopping and breaking down a situation, thinking about the different aspects of it. And then again, how you communicate it, think about the different aspects of change and how to bring somebody along. So in the case of the cohort that we developed, adaptive leadership was just, it was kind of the overarching framework, but there were a lot of other frameworks we brought in too to help folks with the different aspects. But I think there's always something to learn. It's more the thought exercise for me that's important. And again, that intentionality around a space to slow down and think through something that you don't often get.
Yeah. I agree. When I was leading, there were nuggets of my leadership that I would tell people that I was looking to hire during interviews. There are nuggets of my leadership that are not going to change because I personally like them. But I also think that I evolve and change through time. And times change, right? And sometimes relational leadership is key, right? Because the organizational culture is suffering. And so building those relationships and trust is really important. Melissa, your leadership program at Fio Partners on adaptive leadership touched on managing change and engaging staff during really complex times. So that's a different type of leadership style that some leaders may not have and yet may need during these times. Or they, like what we found in the leadership program, they were already adaptive leaders, but didn't have the actual framework to understand how much deeper they can go with this. And so I thought that's what made the program amazing.
Exactly. And I just hope, we supplied them with a bunch of different frameworks. And so the hope is that they go back and they continue using them. So we worked really hard as we were going through the program, to encourage them to think through a particular situation they were dealing with now, but to also save the materials and go back to them later, because this was just the challenge that was currently, top of mind for them. There's going to be a million more challenges. So it's more around the discipline of building a mindset. And, adaptive leadership was selected by the funders of the program as the overarching framework because they saw just the scope and degree of change. And the concepts are really built around those disciplines of diagnosing tough challenges, making the best use of existing strengths and resources, adapting the experimental, recognizing the human elements of change, and valuing diversity and shared power. So again, it's not complete. And we brought in other frameworks around like Williams Bridges work around managing and communicating change. So we brought in other elements, but as an overarching framework, it felt to the funders of the program like the right fit for helping even seasoned leaders slow down and think about how to manage these challenges and bring folks along and make the most out of what they have.
Yeah. And so what are you learning as you are part of the ecosystem that's training and building the skill sets of seasoned leaders? What are you learning through your work?
How to dance. No, and I say that because, and I always try to give folks in any of my program cohorts, a little bit of that caveat emptor of, I would love to hand you a nice, neat bow tie package of solving your problems. Yep. But I'm not going to be able to do that. And you're going to, and they're going to throw questions at me that are very raw, very real. And I've got to try to figure out how to dance and how can I provide them with some guidance, some clarity, some ideas or resources without giving that fake, nice, trite, little answer. So it's just that ability to be flexible and, listen, even when you're hearing something that's right out there in left field, so that you can help them move through whatever the challenges that they're working through.
Yeah. Melissa, what did you learn or what are you learning from the adaptive leadership program or working with seasoned leaders?
that it looks different in every single organization, you know, and that's why I think pairing the learning sessions with the individualized coaching was so important. And I'm so grateful for the funders for making that investment, because it allowed the leaders not only to think about how to apply concepts, but it just gave them a space to be able to talk about what was on their minds. So the first part of each coaching session was, you know, a kind of a guided exercise that helped apply the thinking from the learning session. And then it was an open space to just talk about whatever was on their minds. And so that ability to meet them with individualized support in a place where they could really just talk about what was weighing on them, I think was really important. And then they also built those relationships with each other too in those shared learning sessions where, you know, we would have little groups where they would talk about issues. And, you know, the concepts are great, but that ability to just, as Forrest was saying, be real and talk about what's actually going on and what it really looks like looks different in each organization. And I just remember one person, you know, in a feedback session early on was just like, it is so great to know I'm not alone, you know, that other folks are going through this too. And just that relief of being able to be honest around what was happening and to not feel alone in those struggles, I think was just as important, or not more important, than any framework you could have put in front of them.
Yeah. No, I can totally relate. And Forrest, I want to go back to something you said in the very beginning, which I think is really important and happens to many people. It's called the Peter Principle. When we are good at what we do, and so what happens is that we get promoted into a leadership role because we are good at what we do in our staff role. However, sometimes you can end up in an institution that forgets that leadership is a role within itself and needs new training. So now you have promoted someone to their highest level of incompetency, right? So they become.
And we've got to talk about how, like, what radically different skills they are, right? You know, being an individual contributor versus managing other people.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's I think that can be a real strength in some ways. You know, if you think about it from the perspective of, you know, if you have a supervisor who was maybe a peer or served in your role, did it incredibly well and has moved up, they can be a great resource for their staff and from a technical perspective, right? But you do run that risk of, you know, that person can also become a micromanager because they know how to do your job really well and they want to see it done well.
Right.
And if you're not doing it the way they want it, right, that can be, I think, organizationally a source of frustration.
And they're more comfortable and confident with doing that job versus the management job that they were never trained to do.
Mm-hmm. I think it gets to a root problem, at least that I see, and I'm not saying it's a sole one, but it's certainly a challenge. And that has to do with, you know, thinking about approaching our work from a growth mindset, that mental flexibility. You know, and this is always, I think, something that when you would ask about what do seasoned leaders need to engage in, I think it's maintaining or growing that growth mindset. I've shifted into a new role. What other possibilities are there for me now beyond what I used to do, and kind of being willing and flexible to embrace something new and different, versus falling back into the old comfortable, even though you may be very good at it. You know, so I think that to me is always something we need to be focused on, is being flexible and adapting and changing with the context as it adapts and shifts as well. So,
yeah. You know, I think one of the defining moments for me was when I worked at an organization that prided itself in promoting people from within. And that was a core value. And I was leading HR at this time. And we had promoted someone and to a supervising position. So I don't think she was a manager, but she was supervising. We also had a union. And I went in to her office the second day to check in and see how things are going. And I said, "Hey, how are you?" And she looked like she was about to cry. And I said, "Well, what's wrong?" And she said, "You know, yesterday I was in the union and today I'm supervising my friends."
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it never occurred to me that that happens with the switch of a light, right?
Yeah.
And here I am happy for her, and she's having the worst day ever. And from that moment on, I looked at training very, very differently. And I dedicated all of my work to training and grooming our leaders so that they can be prepared for for the tsunami of stuff that comes to them. And but that did it for me. That did it for me. And that's very real. It happens. How do you manage your friend? Right?
Yeah. And even thinking about in any change process, any leadership role, just where loss comes in. And as you're trying to help folks meet a challenge or navigate a change, being able to spot where you have those feelings of loss that need to be acknowledged and reconciled and moved through in order to help somebody get unstuck and move through a change. Those are the kinds of things, again, that as we get so busy in just the everyday doing, we often forget to kind of do that stop and pause and say, wait a minute. Like, what's really feeding this resistance here? What's really going on? And again, if we think about why would seasoned leaders need a chance to stop and do that kind of thinking, it's because we just get so busy doing that it's hard to just, stop and ask yourself that question.
Yeah. Yeah. So Forrest, in higher education, if somebody were to start supervising or become a dean, is the leadership program mandatory? How or is it voluntary?
So it's every piece of programming that I offer across the state, whether it's faculty, staff, combined, take your pick, everything is voluntary. So there's nothing that I do that's required. There are some different kind of programs that are out there that they do require, but by and large, that tends to be a little bit more of a, process, just because we work in a matrices unionized environment. So there's a lot of negotiating that takes place for any kind of required trainings. My belief, though, is that, and this may, all right, I may have rose-colored glasses on and pie in the sky kind of look, but
that's okay.
People want to do a good job. I think, genuinely speaking, people who go into education are there because they want to have a positive impact ultimately on students. We don't like our time. No one likes their time wasted. So if it's training that's just kind of checking blocks, then it's hard to care. But if it's something that's actually going to serve you in your goal to supporting students, then people want to be involved in that. So I think that's kind of the approach that I look at, is how is this training going to help you do your job well and feel successful in your work? And if I can't answer that question, then I shouldn't be offering that program.
Yes. No, this is great. This is great. And what an investment. And I too believe that people wake up to do great work or to do great things. And so, and then we leave the house. No.
And then, like we talked about in so many things, like then the rush of your actual job takes over. So what is new, or what has changed in the last couple of years, especially in the era of COVID, or what do you think is new that is an exciting innovation in the field right now?
One of the things that I'm really passionate about injecting into any of the different kinds of training that I'm doing is bringing a focus, and Melissa touched on this, and it's bringing a focus to the social and emotional aspects to what we do. In education, social emotional learning, we see a lot of that. And one of the precepts in social emotional learning is, like, we're trying to educate and support the whole student, not just the academic piece. If the student's not doing well, they can't perform in our class as well, right? But what often gets overlooked in the hustle and bustle when we leave the house is that if we aren't taking care of the educators and the support staff and the administrators, if they're not doing well, then the organization's not doing well, which means the students aren't going to get good access to education that they need. So, that's something that I've really tried to make sure that we're doing more of and shining more of a light on, is how are we not just self-care, go take care of yourself, but how are we helping take care of each other, and bringing that to light. Yeah,
Forrest, you said something really important. I've been in a lot of conversations, and everyone's talking about the mental health impact of the pandemic, especially in our young people, and how depression rates are rising, and there are all sorts of things that are occurring. And then one day I was at a meeting, and someone said, we have to check in the mental health of our leaders,
Mhm.
because we do think that they continue to lead. For many, many industries, the pandemic is still very real and very much still a crisis. You know, let's look at our food industry, and food banks are still trying to figure things out. So we still have industries that are knee deep in it. And I was talking to a leader recently, and she's taking her first vacation
Mhm.
since before COVID.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my, right? She's been working 29 months straight. And so we have to pay attention to what our leaders are going through. Because remember, our leaders, the thing about the pandemic is that we weren't just helping a group of people that were being impacted, everyone was
Mhm.
impacted.
We were also
Everyone, even the caretakers, right? The people who were supporting the ones that are most in crisis, they too were in a crisis. So really, I'm glad that that's being talked about and becoming a focus in leadership programs. So, and Melissa, you talk to leaders all the time in your work, and whether or not they're joining a leadership program through Fio, what are you hearing in terms of needs for leaders?
I mean, I do think the burnout is real. We did a survey earlier in the year of organizations across the state. And one of the findings that was not surprising and was consistent with what we saw at the very beginning of the pandemic was that we're looking at about 20 to 25% of organizations looking at an executive leadership transition within the next year. And so when you think about that, like Forrest was saying, with educators, you know, there's opportunity in terms of new leaders being able to step into those new roles, and seeing some exciting transitions happen there with a new generation taking on leadership opportunities. But there's just also general concern in terms of, you know, how are leaders being taken care of? You know, not taking a vacation for 29 months, that's concerning. And to your point, Sin, leaders are burnt out, and need a chance to kind of recharge and reconnect with themselves and just, you know, take care of themselves. That's important.
Yeah, it is. It is. All right. Well, we're almost close to the end of the show. And I just, I'm so happy to have the two of you on here, and bring this angle, right? So that seasoned leaders realize that continuing your learning is not something that should be frowned upon, but should be celebrated, right? But I wonder what tidbits or final thoughts do you have for our audience as they think about and continue on their leadership path? Melissa.
Yeah, I think you said it earlier, Sin. It was, you know, slow down to speed up. And I guess it's having that permission, whether you kind of need the structure of an intentional program or you need to do something to just give yourself space, and you're going to block off some time in your calendar to think about things or go for a walk and think about things. You know, just having that intentional space to slow down your thinking in order to speed up your work. And to help remind yourself of some of those fundamentals that are important no matter what stage of leadership you're in, especially if you're trying to also, you know, nurture and bring folks along in a process.
Yeah. Forrest.
You know, I think the question I think leaders need to always ask themselves is, you know, how am I a team ready organization, and how am I helping lead a team ready organization? So not just how are the employees going to be ready to work and help affect our outcomes, but how am I supporting every different kind of employee that's on my team, wherever they're coming from. That's taking that SEL piece kind of into account. It's thinking about the fact that the landscape has changed drastically over the last few years. And so how am I adapting and changing so that I can support all the different folks on my team, and how can I also model that? And I think that's important. I'm not withholding vacation for myself for 2 years because everyone on my team sees and knows that, and there's the
Yes.
implied expectation that I will
Yeah.
follow that. And
Yeah.
how damaging can that be for the culture that you're trying to create? So I think just thinking, how am I helping lead and model a team-ready, team-focused organization? And learning is an absolute essential part of that for leaders.
Yeah, yeah. Peter, you said you've been learning these several weeks
I have.
as we look at different angles. What are one of your biggest aha moments or learnings?
I think one of them was, this real gap in succession planning that we've talked about before, about having people think one or two levels ahead. But that's not like an individual responsibility. That is an organizational responsibility to keep bringing up the bigger picture, and I think about how I work with organizations that are struggling to map their individual programs to their organizational strategy and mission. And it's because that communication is not happening, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I too walk away with this 2 seats up concept that I had not thought of that way. So thank you, Forrest, for bringing that to the table and bringing it to our viewers. Okay, Melissa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say the other thing that's just striking me is the need to connect with other leaders, and that is something that a leadership program brings, is that sense of I'm not alone. I have a space. Leadership, when you're in the organization, can be very lonely. And so that's, I think, another thing that these leadership learning spaces provide, is that connection to other folks so that you can talk about things and not feel alone. And that in and of itself, I think, is very valuable.
Agreed.
Yes. All right. Well, those are great words to end by. And so we want to say thank you to Forrest and Melissa, also to our listeners and to our viewers. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining us today.